I think this might be.
Cool. All right, everybody. This is actually a very exciting meetup for me. I think all the D3 meetups that we put on are very exciting, of course. I'm a technologist. I love what we can do with data visualization. But this one's also a little bit sentimental or personal for me because my father is a professor of the humanities. And this presentation is a collaboration between myself and him. And the last time we collaborated was probably 10 years ago at a Quake 3 LAN party with his friends that I got to go to in high school. So, yeah, this what I want to show you is kind of, it is a work in progress. We've been working on it since about October, and it's been a lot of fun, a learning experience for both of us. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoy as well. So who here can tell me what D3 stands for? All right, cool. So you get the joke now, right? Oh, sorry, yeah, data-driven documents. And what my father studies is, or one of the research projects he's working on deals with Old English manuscripts. So this story is about how one monk, or, well, we think he's a monk or a scribe of some sort, in Worcester, England, in the 13th century, was trying to understand Old English. So I'm going to actually break out of my presentation real quick and leaf through my father's, and mostly for the nice pictures so you can kind of get a sense for the context. But back then, all the priests, the Catholic Church was very powerful, right? And the Pope had decreed that we need to, preach more to the people, and we need to do it in their language. So everybody, all the literate people, the members of the church spoke Latin, read and wrote in Latin. But most of the people that they were supposed to preach to spoke some form of Old English. And actually, at that particular time and place, they didn't have much documentation of vernacular, prayers, so like the Lord's Prayer, that kind of stuff. So this monk that we're going to talk about had these documents that were probably 100 or 200 years before his time in this one abbey or church. So he was going to use these to try to learn Old English, an older form of English, so that he could preach it out loud. And what he did was mark up these manuscripts. They didn't have photocopying or anything back then, so he just had these originals and started putting his pen all over it. And he would put these little marks. So one thing you may or may not know is that back then, nobody read in their mind. Like, when you read, it was to read to other people. You read out loud. Like the idea of sitting down and reading a book to yourself, like a nice cozy couch, didn't exist. So punctuation was actually for pronunciation, like for how to pause and how to break up your sentence. It wasn't, well, how we're used to it, right? And so so you can see that he puts in a lot of his own punctuation to try to. It's also sounding out. So if you're imagining, like, you're teaching a child how to read the letters, in the same way, this was a tool for sounding out how to say this stuff. And there's a bunch of notes as well where he's written in Latin around in the margins. And so also we don't know his name, but his nickname is the Tremulous Scribe of Worcester, and tremulous because he had sort of a shaky hand. I don't know what that means. Let's see. Yeah, just more examples. So the point is, though, in the research here, that we want to understand both what's going on linguistically, maybe historically. We can see that he marks up certain parts of the document, like these parchments, which I'll show you in a second. will be like 200 pages, right? But he only marks up a handful of them in some places and a handful in other places. And you can see a lot of where he marks up and writes the notes in the margins is either prayers or rules for monastic living or being a good person or something like that. So I'm just going to keep going through some pictures. Here, like all these notes, these red are notes that this monk has made, and that can kind of indicate what he was interested in, and therefore what kind of stuff the church was interested in that time. But that's these notes have been studied for a while because you can read them and they stick out. But my father's research, or what he wants to research, is the punctuation, because he thinks that well, first of all, no one's really been looking at those markings in detail or in aggregate, and you can see that there's a lot of places, right, that have been marked up. And sometimes what he does is change the original punctuation, so it's not new stuff. And then in some cases, these margins don't exist. I'll show you a picture in a second. Like some of these manuscripts get burned in a fire, and you lose all the nice notes, and so all that's left is the punctuation. So if you can use that to find out what he's interested in, we can focus on looking at the content in that area. So in October, we had a little family vacation, and he was telling me about this, and I've been sharing, some of the D3 stuff and, the cool work from Elijah and the other humanities stuff. So he was kind of aware of what kinds of stuff you can do, and he was like, hey, I'd love to be able to take all the punctuation in a manuscript and maybe like visualize it somehow. Can we do something to find some patterns or maybe there's something there. So I was like, yeah, that's cool. We just need some data, right? And our first attempt was to say, okay, he knows that there's like 8 different kinds of punctuation that he cares about, and it's either original punctuation or this tremulous punctuation. And so we decided on a spec for a CSV file, and can't really read it at this resolution, but that's okay. We'll get into some more interesting stuff soon. But the idea here is that he would go through one of these pictures, right, and put this in Photoshop and say, oh, okay, this is line 2 and like this punctuation mark, and he'd use the measurement tool in Photoshop and find out how many pixels it was from here, and then he would record what kind of punctuation it was, and he's put all this stuff in a spreadsheet. And I think he told me that he spent an entire Saturday or something doing this and got like 1 file done. It was like 50 punctuation marks or something for a couple pages. It was really laborious, but we're making the data, and he sent it over to me. He's like, can you work with this? Is this like a good format? And I was like, yeah, it's a good format, but I can't really stand the thought of you sitting around, spending that much time to make the CSV. So we decided to make a little tool, and this will kind of give a little more context to how much work was ahead of him. This is most of one manuscript, and there's 2 he's interested in. This one he has high-res scans of, so we're starting here, and you can see, it's like so for each one there's 2. So it goes to 90, but it's actually twice that, so 180 individual pages. I think this is cutting off a few too. And we made a little. It's a web app. It works on the iPad, so you could do it on the plane. He was on the way to a conference, or you could, sit around and just kind of touch on the document, choose what kind of punctuation it was, whether it was converted or not, how certain he is too, right? Because originally he was like, can you do some cool like computer vision stuff? I read about all this machine learning things. Like we just find all the modified punctuation, right? But I was like, your eyes are probably better than any program I could write in a reasonable amount of time for now. So we worked on this, and I can actually show a little demo. So this is, my local development version of these. I have my console open. So this is, zoom out a little bit, what you might see, and if we were to go zoom in, I don't actually know how to find these punctuations. Let's pretend this is one. We click on it, or you touch the iPad, you choose if it was tremulous or the original one, what kind of punctuation. These are sort of proxies for Old English punctuation. And eventually he wants to be able to mark glosses, which are like the little notes around here, marginal, all that kind of stuff. So we haven't built that part of the data collection yet. And then if you don't, if that was erroneous, just delete it. So this actually ended up saving him a lot of time. Oh wait, before I get into that, this is an example of the burn documents. So this he doesn't have high res scans of. It might load slowly if I click on it. But the other thing we want to do is he's going to go, I think it's in the British Museum, so he's going to go with his iPad and look at the real one and then click on that and be like, yeah, that's it. You couldn't see it in the low res scan, but you could do it. So I guess it's as good a time as any to explain that at work, actually, I call myself a data alchemist. We all know that data science is the new hotness or whatever, but I like to call myself a data alchemist because I don't think the science is done yet. We're still figuring out what we can do and how to do it, but also because a lot of the value I feel that I bring and what I'm excited about is creating the data. So not just analyzing what's out there and trying to find it, and we can kind of recognize, oh, how might we use the technology of the day to create new sets of data and then extract value from that, and then apply the best scientific tools we have to understand that and create gold out of it, let's say. So anyway, that's my spiel. But so we made this workflow app. We did it in an open source data-driven framework called Derby.js, which is like a new alternative to Meteor, if you're familiar with Meteor.js or Angular.js kind of. Made it really fast to build. And so now we have data. We have something like he's manually entered 5,500 points since the winter break when we had this prototype going. So that, and he's been enjoying it on his iPad when he gets a free second. It's much better than the old way. So this is my first prototype visualization of trying to show, what we've collected so far, where the blue dots are original punctuation and these yellow dots, which hopefully you can see, are the interventions. And you can see one of the things that he had kind of he knew from studying these documents, very closely, is that there are, this guy, whoever he was really interested in these pages. So whatever is on these pages are something that, are of historical significance and we can research further. But then there's long stretches of, and I'll show the live, oh yeah, this was made with D3, and I prototyped this in this environment that I built called Tributary, which I can talk about later if you're interested. But here we can see, if we scroll down, there's a bunch of sections where there's almost nothing. I think that this actually might be either a marginal gloss or an error, to ask him. And then if you keep going, there's more sections of nothing, nothing, nothing. And he hasn't actually entered this data yet. He's still working on it. But then he knew that, oh hey, here's another big period of activity. And then this version of the visualization, I'm also trying to show the punctuation mark, and it's a little harder to. Oops, that doesn't look good. Zoomed in like that. Anyway. Just trying to experiment with what ways I could represent this data from a bird's eye view to let him, or when really this is for him to communicate to other people the things that he knows is interesting in his domain, in a way that they can immediately see, oh yeah, we should focus on that stuff. And we also, with the other types of interventions, this should become a more interesting, colorful visualization as well. Showing where he's glossing, and then he can kind of confirm his theory that if we have all the other interventions here, where the punctuations show us new stuff versus the stuff that everyone else has already poured over, maybe. And then I have another visualization. I'll just show the live version. This is sort of a bar chart where for every page I'm just drawing the marks in order. I always start with the tremulous, the yellow ones are the interventions, but then also every original punctuation. So this is, you can again see this pattern of, oh, here's some activity. You can see like the relative activity as well. As long as there is some, then there's going to be the section where my dad hasn't entered the data yet, but then we go down here, okay, we see another burst of activity. So as we also introduce these other types of things, we could color code this with to indicate how much of each type of activity is going on. Not showing any counts or like aggregate numbers, because that may not be that interesting right now in terms of the patterns we're interested in. It's more like, where do we look? But yeah, let's see. So yeah, that's pretty much where we're at now. Making our data, trying to put it up and get some communication tools going, and then hopefully we can, as we flesh out the data set, we can draw some new insights and tell you something about some old English. All right, thank you. Any questions? Sorry?
I was going to ask if you could talk about tributary.
Oh yeah. So tributary is in-browser IDE, so development environment. So on one side we have HTML or SVG. In this case, all of these it's just pure HTML. I didn't use any SVG. And on this side you have JavaScript, or you can have JavaScript, CSS, and anytime that you type anything in here or change anything here, if we want to change like our background color, it updates the stuff on the left automatically. The same with the code. So this is kind of a rapid prototyping environment for exploring ideas. I built it, I started it a couple years ago with some friends, and it, a lot of what it was for was actually to help me understand D3. So every time I wanted to, I read about something or saw, one of Mike Bostock's blocks, or someone do something cool, or some new technique in SVG or HTML, I was like, oh, I want to try that, myself. And then I would have to create a new file, find the link to D3, start up a server, do like 5 minutes worth of things, and by the end of that 5 minutes, my idea is probably dead anyway, right? So with this, you just click, I want to create a new thing. If you're on like the tributary homepage, you can, start with a clean slate, gives you an empty one, or fork an example. Forking meaning, duplicating for yourself. Like if I click this, it'll make a new copy of it, and then I can go in here and edit it and be like, oh, what happens when I move that, change that number? What happens when I change this number? So, just making it very immediate to try out your ideas. And with something like D3, which really does have a sharp learning curve, it's really helpful to kind of, get a visceral sense, an intuitive sense for it. You had a question?
Yeah. So I know a little bit about the tremulous and I know that something that's really important about him is he moved around, and it took them a while to discover that there was one person that linked all these things together. And also through time, like his whole, he had like a huge career. This is like his life's work.
Right.
So I'm wondering, how would you add location and time information to this type of model? Because that seems like, if you're talking about how this reflects the priorities of the church and reaching out to people, or changes in the demographics of the actual, communities around the church, time and place would really matter. So I'm just wondering, how might you extend what you've done?
Absolutely.
To those dimensions.
Yeah, so I think even before getting to that, one of the first things we want to extend to is the content itself, right? So even before we can say what's the impact of looking at this content in a time or place, it's what content is it, and so we're gonna, try to, we can mark the beginning and ends of certain passages and store that metadata. I think with any project or visualization, this, to me, I see this as just like the first start, the tool to enable. So once we can collect this for this manuscript and maybe all of his other works, is actually the real desire. Then we can say, okay, we have certain patterns amongst these. Now, how do we organize those, bigger pieces into something that we can then have metadata about, right? One general way I think about almost anything is that you can represent a lot of ideas as a collection of metadata, like documents, right? So like each of these marks is really just, let me see if I'm logging it out. Let's see, so here's 49 marks that go to one of these folios, the original ones, or here's 16 tremulous ones. Right, it's just, I don't know if you can see this, but it's just a bunch of text, with some key. Each one has the same keys and then different data for each one, right? So for each of these folios, there's also something describing what, manuscript they belong to and which folio it is. And then for each manuscript, we could annotate it with time and place if we know that. And if we know time and place, then we can show it on the map, like the post offices. And then you could, depending on what you're trying to communicate, you could zoom in, click into each one and see these patterns. I think that this is also kind of a first start, because what we probably really want to do is, okay, now we found the interesting part, now pull that out, and that becomes its own like conceptual piece. And this was just like a tool on the way to kind of find that.
And maybe as you enrich the data set, your dad's a specialist in identifying the punctuation marks, but there's another layer, so maybe you make another application to allow that specialist to collect information, and then maybe there's a geographer that specializes in the church.
Yeah, and then you have a place where these visualizations come together.
And just layer the data on top of itself.
Absolutely.
And really enrich the document.
Can I ask a quick, I just noticed when you brought that up that you have a certainty as 100 as a numerical value. Why isn't that a Boolean? How do you
Oh no, it's 0 to 100, so it's like...
How do you determine if it's 62% certainty?
Well, that's the thing with certainty, you're not really certain, right? So it's just, whatever he deems appropriate, right? And
it's totally subjective on your
yeah.
like expert opinion on the documents.
Well, because at some point, like, everything is subjective, right? So like the expert is putting in their own bias, so it's actually an avenue for him to communicate how much bias he thinks he has. And then we could also, we could totally represent that visually as well. I didn't even try that yet, but like as opacity or size, there's all kinds of ways we could encode that. But I think that would also be a way. It's like, okay, I have like 10% of these have less than 90% certainty, so let's look at those. Let me send those to my colleague, and they can look at it at the museum or stuff like that.
That's a brilliant way to incorporate the researcher's perspective into the data in a way that's like non-intrusive. Like, I think that's really clever, actually.
Cool. Yeah. You had a question? Yeah.
One question. What's the reason for the choice to use Derby.js?
So
the prototype looked pretty good. So
thanks. Well, so we're building that at work. That's what we build, the app that I'm building. So I work for a company called Lever. We're building hiring software, and it's a big data-driven app. And so now that it's pretty mature, I'm starting to use it in my side projects. And I was able to build this this over the course of like 3 pretty lazy afternoons, and it worked on iPad out of the box, and it's also like real time. So if anyone does have their laptop open, we could have some fun with this. And I have this great. Do you guys know like all the crazy top level domains that came out? So like I have .solutions. It's like what? So I made inane.solutions. But it's inane.solutions:3000. It's, I just kind of threw it up on a server, so it's not like a nice domain name. But you can try annotating this test document yourself, and as you can see, someone already is. Everything in Derby syncs immediately. It's called live bound, right? So any piece of data, any of those JSON objects gets synced through the server to all the clients. If I change this, you'll see it on yours. If someone wants to change it back, we'll see it. Oh, someone deleted it. Thanks. This one, or clicking on the converted one. What's going on? Trusting you guys here. It does. It can. It's using something called browser channel right now, but we have a WebSocket plugin for that. But
compared to Meteor, is it very similar?
Yeah, it's pretty similar to Meteor. I think some of the advantages are it's its own set of node modules. So it uses npm. It doesn't have its own package thing. You can use any part of it. So just the client side templating stuff, or the syncing model, that kind of stuff. And yeah, I've taken to really using this to build the UI, and then I use D3 as like visualization components inside it. So it's a component thing like Angular and React has. So you can make yourself a chart component and then like handle all the data syncing and events in Derby, and so it's quite nice.
You're probably gonna want to change your domain so people don't get in here and like just.
Oh no, I made this one its own domain for you guys to play with, and
not too much fun.
Not ruin my dad's hard work.
Dad's like,
Yeah.
what?
There's
no mode
yeah.
tremulous.
Yeah. You didn't have any smiley face. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So the really interesting thing about this is you found like a very non-technical person, and you created a really cool technical tool for them. Do you have any thoughts about that matching process? Like, let's say like you wanted to run some kind of hackathon where like you find these academics doing some kind of research and team them up with some developers to build some kind of tool. Could you talk about what that process is like, or what worked well in the communication, what you coming from a technology background had to kind of explain to the non-technical user?
Sure. So the question, just to repeat it, is, what can I explain a little bit the process for, bringing a very technical solution to a non-technical person in a, sort of traditionally non-technical domain, and how did we effectively create this? So I'd like to sort of disqualify my answer by saying my dad isn't non-technical. I grew up with computers. He had an Apple II when I was born, and so he's always loved computers and understood like the power of digitization. But he's non-technical in the sense that he doesn't program or create software. But to sort of answer the spirit of your question, I think the most important thing is the speed of iteration, and that is like I'll shamelessly promote Derby for that. Partly, but though because I have been writing Derby for like a year and a half now full time, and before that I wrote D3 pretty much full time, a year and a half, right? The speed at which I could say, oh, like what about this? What do you think? And then he would click on it. Like the iteration on this like menu, this looks a lot better and is much more usable than it first was. And that whole thing with the CSV thing, right? Like he gave it a real go to manually like transcribe everything into an Excel document. And and it was really from me seeing like how untenable that was, right? Because the original idea was more to get to something like this was what I was imagining when he was just describing to me the problem, right? I was like, I want to see this. I know that if you just give me a bunch of rows with the right properties, I can make this. I've seen it done with D3 before. This was actually, to be honest, the first time I really used d3.nest. So each of these is its own canvas. This is 5,500 points. So I didn't want to render all that in one HTML or SVG thing. So I used D3 to nest the marks for each folio, and then looped over them to draw them on canvas. But to get to this, I was like, I need this kind of data, because on pen and paper we kind of sketched this out. He was like, oh, that'd be really cool. I'd love to see something like that and see it for all of them. He could picture it. But then that the CSV thing turned out to be way too hard on him, even knowing what he wanted to see. So then I was like, okay, so I kind of realized I have this thing that makes it easy for me to create and manage an application that's just a list of points or a list of data, right? Like that's kind of what Derby is for. Is like, oh, you create a collection of data and then you represent it in some way, and then you sync it up. So then we iterated. It was like the first thing was like, oh yeah, you can click here and it draws a box, and then you can enter some stuff. And then I think so for a hackathon, I would say, as long as the people hacking can very quickly iterate on their ideas, and sort of also I think one of the things that I've really learned a lot since kind of being in the Bay Area is about design and like user design thinking, user interviews, that kind of thing, like trying to have the empathy to figure out like what is this person really trying to do, asking the right questions, and being able to narrow down what my efforts should be so that I can very quickly make something that will enable them to tell me what they actually want, right? Because my dad's not going to know how like touch dragging works on the iPad and two-finger zooming and all that stuff. I mean, he can do it intuitively, but he's not going to describe to me like I want to be able, because on the iPad you can you zoom in and then click and then you zoom out, and but if he can play with it and be like, hey, the first prototype he kept accidentally creating new marks because I hadn't done the touch stuff quite right, and he kept being like, hey, and I want this to be a drop down, not a tech. I don't want to type it every time, that kind of stuff, right? He's not going to tell me that up front, but if he can play with it, then the process goes much faster, and you could do something. It was essentially a hackathon this Christmas break, so that's nice. Yeah, and yeah.
Your ability to write your own tools for your needs is very impressive. Just want to say that first.
Thank you.
Second, is it paying off? Is your father starting to get? I know you're early into it, but is he starting to see patterns? Is he excited about where it's going? Is it?
He's really excited. I think for him, he's already seen these patterns, but when he's been showing his colleagues, and he's already got offers for like 3 more manuscripts, and and some potential collaboration. So I think other people now are also saying like, hey, this would be really great for my documents or for these other ones, and yeah.
I have a related question, and that is, how generalizable is your approach? Can it be easily used for another sort of manuscript study? So that's generalizable sort of to other manuscript projects. And then is it possible to get the data out in other ways that would be sort of more standard for the academic community?
Absolutely.
Right? They don't necessarily want to see a bunch of D3 data, but they might want to see it in another form that is useful.
Absolutely. So if you think about this as, this is just one image. There's a certain number of pixels that is width and height, and all of these things are just drawn as offsets. And so I'm rendering this image at like 980 pixels, let's say, some arbitrary number, and that makes the height some other arbitrary number. So every dot that I draw, or every square I draw, and you can also imagine that I could like draw a rectangle or a circle or like do other shapes, because that's what the next thing we're going to do is like, here is a gloss, right? Like he wants to be like, oh, this is this word, and mark that. So anything that's an image that you want to mark up with regions and tag with metadata would work in this system. And then if the data that you're saving is just a flat JSON object, you could easily represent that as a CSV, like I showed in the beginning, right? Like you can transfer between JSON and even here actually. So these JSON files are on the internet, so you can look at them. In fact, why don't we just do that real quick, so you can believe me. So each of these, it just has like a folio ID. The manuscript is a part of when, I even save metadata like when each mark was created. So even though it's, 2015, right? We're still, we'll know the tremulous hand of David Johnston like mark these up at exactly this time since 1970. But here's the X and Y, and as long as we know the original dimension, or width and height that we were drawing within, we can scale that to any size, right? So that's how I did this visualization. Is I just said, oh, I want these each to be 80 pixels wide because it seems like a reasonable size for a thumbnail, and so I'm just going to scale everything from what I recorded it to that size. So yeah, I think it's completely generalizable. And kind of related to the making your own tools thing, recognizing that, like I feel like that, to me, that's the underlying thing that enables this, right? Is like the confidence or the sort of exponential payoff you get from being able to bootstrap yourself, right? Like every time I want to see something, I just make something that lets me see it, right? And yeah, I think it could totally be generalized, and it's all open source. I didn't put the link anywhere, but my GitHub handle is Angelot. The project name is Tremor. So it's all here. It's not really documented. I mean, we're just ripping this out. But I'd be happy to answer any questions over Twitter, email, or anything like that. Yeah.
Maybe just to kind of expand and answer to your question. So as a literary scholar myself, if I wanted to see something, if I wanted to look at the influence of the blues on Harlem Renaissance texts, and I'm looking at particular licks, I could use this, I could go through the text, find those particular moments when the blues are being invoked in those texts, and then see it visually like this and start to get a sense of which blues phrases or which blues songs. So I'm just, kind of going along with the excitement of this and thinking about that's how it could work for me.
Yeah, I see tons and tons of possible applications, but how hard it is to take your very, very specifically designed application and make it usable for something that is really different. But.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably more difficult now because not very many people are familiar with Derby, but it's also open source. It's all based in JavaScript, HTML, so it's not impossible for someone familiar with something else like Angular to get into. The pattern or the framework that I built is not that, like, it would also be very easy, I think, to reproduce in something like Ruby on Rails and D3 or Angular or something like that. So, like, more power to anyone who wants to do that. I think, yeah, and I'd be happy to explain, like, the principles that went behind that offline. But it sounds like, yeah, what you guys really want is, like, Rap Genius for humanities or something. Or this is the open source Rap Genius. Yeah.
Yes, that's maybe a complicated question, so I apologize in advance. But you didn't really say much about the content of those manuscripts, but I'm curious, like the representation was a very strong XY.
Yeah.
And I could see that if we were analyzing paintings or something that were purely visual.
Mm-hmm.
But here, it's text, and the text is one-dimensional. So I'm wondering if we're getting irrelevant information on the y-axis, right? Like really, it's just a stream of text. It's not poetry, right? It doesn't break in places. It's not music that you were talking about. So the fact that things might line up or create a diagonal going down is kind of irrelevant and distracting almost. I wonder if you thought about that, if that's an issue.
It's a good point. I would say there's a couple ways though that XY, like 2 dimensions, could matter. So especially in terms of the marginal glosses, where it is 2-dimensional proximity to some text, right? And he didn't like draw lines exactly to what he's talking about. So, and I also think it depends on the amount, like what you're trying to communicate or get out of the representation, right? So here, really the only thing I'm trying to get across is density. And you know, so far all I've tried to explore is the density of interventions. And so these are two ways to do that, right? And actually this is like a somewhat one-dimensional way that's more maybe more effective at showing where the activity is. The thing that I liked about this is that we could actually overlay this on thumbnails of the actual document, or you know, in the case of this representation, which is also a data visualization in some sense, if you had all kinds of different marks and all kinds of stuff, you'd be augmenting the reader's experience of this document, right? So like being able to say, oh, I want to see, you know, show me the glosses. I'm a historian of these manuscripts, but I'm not familiar with this one. Just like point it out to me because someone else has done the work. So I think it's valuable to capture the XY data. I think you're right.
But I think if like, we go back to the
Mm-hmm.
thumbnails, like underneath where you've got fork, I mean, it's a really strong vertical with dots.
Oh, this right here, yeah.
Why should that be?
So
And that appears in a lot of this, and I don't understand why, if it's free-flowing prose, why they would want to.
It might just be that see all these punctuations along this document, like these look like they're all important for some reason. So yeah, I mean, because these were, and I don't even know what these numerals are. So yeah, I think like you're right in one sense that we, you know, or the thing that's actually most interesting to me is when we digitize like the entire text too, and get, you know, the line numbers, and we could place the punctuation in a one-dimensional thing. That, you know, that would be super useful for certain kinds of communication, I think. But I think, you know, one thing to be aware of is like, I'm not really saying like that the 2D representation here is meaningful in itself. It's more just like, hey, like we can see the kind of activity, and when we do get into the content, we'll want more of a different representation, and there you might, because then we'll know it's like, hey, actually like the Lord's Prayer starts right here and it ends, you know, right here, or whatever the actual content is, because he did tell me about, he knows where they start and stop each like different, because it's a mix of prayers and stories and rules and stuff, and so then we could overlay that, you know, with you know, I would love to have sort of lightly colored lines that correspond to each kind of passage and then overlay those, right? And the other thing is that, yeah, he does want to capture which line each of these things are on, but it's not always on a line of text. It's above or below, you know, this gloss, and he may associate it with a particular line if he knows. And yeah, I'm honestly not that clear on what will happen when we get there. Yeah. Cool. We normally have a few show and tells. We ask people to, you know, do 2 minutes to show off some project they're working on, and I'd like to get into those, to do a couple before we have to go. Is that okay if we had 1 or 2? Oh, we have to go? All right. Well, then I'm sorry for taking up everyone's time. But thank you all for indulging me, and thank you for hosting us, Carlos, and Product School. And you know, it was really great having the digital humanities and the D3 meetup come. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody.